Welcome to the Sanity Project podcast, the place for internet technology professionals whose work-life balance plan has imploded. We are here to provide solutions that will help the IT pro live a sane, healthy, and prosperous life. Here's your host, Joanne Victoria.
Hello, this is Joanne Victoria from AskJoanneVictoria.com. I am the host of the Sanity Project podcast. The Sanity Project podcast is a platform for experts in the self-help, self-development community to share their wisdom, expertise, and solutions that will help the IT pro live a sane, healthy, and prosperous life. Our guest today, Sherry Bevan, that's Sherry, Sherry, Bevan, Bevan, is from across the pond. So as it's early in the morning for me, it is late in the afternoon or early evening for Sherry. Sherry Bevan is an author, coach, speaker, a former global head of IT services at an international law firm. Sherry also founded The Confident Mother, an independent coaching practice, in 2012. Sherry now works with ambitious women in technology and professional services who want to confidently balance work and life, which is what Sherry is going to be talking to us about today. What Sherry is talking about to our audience, our IT pros, is getting the confidence to create the work-life balance that works for you requires a two-pronged approach. And Sherry, welcome to the show, and please share your two-pronged approach.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. Very honored to be here and sharing my English accent with your audience today.
Well, I'm sure they're going to love it as much as I do.
So my two-pronged approach that I talk about, there are two sides of the story when we talk about work-life balance for women. As an individual, I need to take some responsibility for that work-life balance. And that's primarily, I work with individual women who want to get a better work-life balance. But then we also have to work with the organisation so that they can make the landscape and make the culture more accepting so that we're not all working 24-hour days and that we do get that work-life balance. Interestingly, some research just came out today in the UK, an agency, Timewise, that specialises in opportunities for flexible working, so basically a recruitment agency. And their statistics show that only 9.2% of jobs are, give the opportunity for flexible working, which is way, way below the number of women that actually want to have flexible working. And of course, it's not just women, it's men as well. But I think, the gap between how many of us want to be able to balance work and life in a more flexible way and the opportunities available is huge. And I think there is, I work with some organisations to help them figure out how to make that happen. But the majority of my work is really with individual women, helping them to have the confidence, but also helping them to take responsibility for their work-life balance. And I accept that for some of us, there are going to be aspects of your life that you can't control completely. For some of us go back to work after our children are born, or our children are grown up, and perhaps we've got parental responsibilities now in terms of looking after our elderly parents. Sometimes there's some compromise that you have to make. You have to work in order to pay your mortgage.
Right.
So there's always going to be that compromise. But I do feel that very often we've actually got to take responsibility ourselves for getting the work-life balance that works, or at least a work-life balance that works as good as you can make it. And I also think we have a responsibility to look after ourselves. And often the women that I work with, looking after yourself from my point of view is one of the most important things to do. But what I find is often it's the easiest thing to drop. And I think that's when perhaps many women struggle with getting a work-life balance because they don't actually stop to look after themselves first. So their stress levels go up. The overwhelm feels even more overwhelming because they're not taking care of themselves first. And I personally, one of my principles with the Confident Mother is that wellness, looking after your own physical, emotional, and mental wellness is so important. And if you do that, then actually the work-life balance will feel more balanced because you're able to cope better with the stresses and strains of trying to work and run a family and run a house and all that kind of thing.
Well, two things just came up for me. One, the 9.2% figure, which is really low, and in our day and age, it's just shocking. And the other thing was I started working when I was forced to do this because I was divorced. I had 3 children under the age of 9, and they were 9, 7, and 5 or something like that. Whatever, there were 3 in 3 years. So I do not even recall having taken care of myself at all. There was absolutely no time for that. It wasn't even a thought in my mind. I went to work, was working close to where I lived, thank goodness, and raised my children pretty much by telephone. There were people watching them at the end of the school day, but during the day, the younger ones were not in school. But I never thought of myself as having a moment to myself, ever. Maybe taking a shower.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing for many women. They don't look after themselves and find they don't have the time to look after themselves. But I think sometimes it can be very simple things. It doesn't necessarily mean taking lots of time for yourself, but at least finding 10 minutes in the day to read a magazine or to sit down and read a book or to sit down and do nothing and drink a hot cup of, the English like their cups of tea.
Sure.
But sitting down, for 10 minutes to drink a cup of tea when there's nobody clamoring for mummy time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's one of the ways that we can build our own resilience. And if you've got that resilience, when you do get the knockbacks that inevitably will happen as a woman, as a mother, as a parent, there are going to be days where perhaps the childcare is sick, or the children are sick, or there's been a disaster at work where you get knockbacks. But by looking after yourself, you're able to better deal with the stress because you've got more resilience and you can kind of pick yourself up a bit more easily and accept, well, okay, so today's going to be really hard because the children are sick and I've not had enough sleep, but I will, this will pass and I will get through.
Right. Now, that issue about this research that found 9.2% of the jobs or the companies who have the jobs supported flex work. And what do you think? We won't go into great detail, but what do you think is the resistance of the companies for flex work to women?
There are many different factors here, but I think some of the resistance comes from thinking that flexible working is not. I think very often there is most definitely an unconscious bias in organisations, and I think at the moment, currently, flexible working is seen as a female issue. That it's something that affects women, and I think when it starts to be seen as an issue that affects all of us and that is important for all of us, then I think attitudes will change. I think as well some of the resistance is because people don't always understand or appreciate how many different options there are for flexible working. So, for example, you could do a job share, where 2 people work the same job, but perhaps both do 3 days a week and have an overlap day.
Sure.
You could have a day a week where you're working from home. And I think very often flexible working is seen as this thing that's got to be fairly rigid and fairly structured, but flexible working can also be as simple as being able to work from home every now and again, or being able to come in late every now and again. And I think very often in organizations, in companies, we're very fixated on the number of hours we work, and we base our success at work on the number of hours that we've worked rather than the results that we've achieved.
Right, and I think that's wrong. I mean, that's the best word I can come up with, because it's been noted that your best hours are the first 4 anyway. And,
exactly.
And the remaining X number, usually 4 to 6, depending upon where you work and who you work for, it diminishes down to 0 or close to it as the day goes on.
Absolutely.
And then you're repeating lots of things as well.
Mm. And I think one of the other factors that I've seen talking to organisations recently about flexible working is that very often for some people who benefit from flexible working, it's almost an irony that in fact they're very inflexible in the way that they do that flexible working. So you for example, in a law firm, so a lot of the women that I work with are lawyers and work in law firms, where perhaps if you're a lawyer that's working full time, we all know that lawyers don't work 9 till 5. They could well be there from 8 till 8. But when a woman perhaps has taken reduced hours, maybe doing a 3-day week or a 4-day week, there's often a resentment builds up because it's felt perhaps sometimes that she's not able to ever be available other than outside of those contracted hours. Whereas if you work in legal, there are always going to be those times where the client rings up late on a Friday afternoon to say, we need this done by 11 o'clock tonight, or we need to submit this pitch or this tender. And I think sometimes that leads to a resentment among your team colleagues if it's seen that the person who's benefiting from the flexible working is also not getting involved in the flexibility of the work requirements. And sometimes flexible working is seen as inflexible because the people...
It appears as if the person, we're talking about women right now who do try to work a flex job, are given quote unquote special treatment.
Right.
That's not true. Well, they're given special treatment to a certain extent, but generally the women work harder in those fewer hours that they're on the job.
Oh, absolutely. And, very much you can see when you talk to women who have gone back to work either on reduced hours or maybe doing a 4-day week, or if they need to leave on time, at 5 o'clock to pick up children from nursery or childcare, very often they're so much more productive and so much more focused than they would have been before children because they know they've got to get their work done in those hours. Whereas if you don't have to get home at a certain time every evening, you can be a bit more relaxed and laid back during your day, and you're not as focused and productive, and actually you waste time during the day. And I think that's what often employers miss out on or don't appreciate, the increase in productivity if you are doing either reduced hours or some other form of flexible working.
Yeah, certainly on the part of women. I do know that there are some men that I'm aware of in large corporations who arrive late every day. I don't know what deals they have with their employers, but their immediate supervisors are aware of it because they are responsible for dropping their children off at daycare and or school, and that's SLP. And then there are some men also who leave promptly at whatever, let's say 5 o'clock, to pick up their children. So there are some people who are able to have the confidence, which is what you're talking about. People have to, know what they want and find the confidence to ask for it. That the men seem to do it fine. I think it's women who have issues in standing inside themselves and being strong enough to ask for what they want, be it to arrive late, leave on time. These are not attorneys, but still, they're in large corporations where they're responsible for their work. So that I think that is a gender issue as well, that men have a less difficult time taking a stand on something. Doesn't have to be aggressive, but making a point. And women are still afraid in many instances to ask for what they want.
Yes, I think women often fear about the impact it's going to have on their career. And some men tell me that they worry about the impact it's going to have on their career as well when they ask for flexible working, because they worry about, does that mean I'm going to be seen as less focused, as no longer care as much about my career and not so interested? And then it's kind of ironic sometimes that once men start to ask for flexible working as well, that they sometimes have this absolutely the same worries and fears about the effect it may have on their career. And I know, other people who've done flexible working or perhaps agreed a way where they can leave on time on a regular basis, or on certain days that they have to leave at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock or whatever. And there was one woman, I was reading her story, and in order to get around this, most of her meetings and most of her work took place in one building of the company that she worked for. But so that nobody noticed, on a Thursday night when she had to leave a bit earlier than usual, she made sure her meetings were in the other building
Clever.
at the end of the day, so that nobody really knew, has she gone home yet or is she in the other building for a meeting, which I thought, that's smart thinking.
Absolutely smart thinking. Absolutely. Good for
So,
her.
yeah. So I think it's tough, because I think, flexible working, certainly in the UK, it's still underutilized, and the more senior you are, then the less opportunities there seem to be to take up flexible working. But like I say, I think that the thing with flexible working is that you can't really, from an organization's point of view, it's not about having one fixed policy that has to apply to everybody. It's about approaching each case on an individual basis. So for example, when I worked at the law firm, my flexible working, I was based in London, but my role was based in Chicago in the last 3 or 4 years there. So my version of flexible work with my firm was that I worked 2 days a week from home. So Tuesday and Friday I worked from home, and on Tuesdays I didn't start work until 11 o'clock London time, which fitted in nicely, because then I worked until 10 o'clock London time, with a kind of a funny gap in the middle of the day.
Mm-hmm.
But that meant that I could then attend the regular weekly managers meeting that was taking place at something like 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock at night. It must have been Chicago time, which for me was pretty late at night. So that was flexible working in a different way. But there were occasions where I would go into the office on a Tuesday and then work a really long day in order to still attend the manager meeting, but then perhaps take a couple of hours back later on in the week or the next month. And I think that's the key to get flexible working flexibly, is to have that flexibility, that it's not all give on one side, but it's give and take on both sides,
Right.
Employer and employee.
I would just like to think that results matter, and the results don't matter in a specific period of time, unless there's a time frame on something.
Right.
But results and outcomes are what's important in these situations. Not so much, are you here at 8:30 and are you leaving at 4:30? And most people I know don't even take time for lunch.
Exactly.
So they're working through it.
Yeah, and I think it does depend on the role that you're doing. So I was responsible for our global IT service desk, and so my service desk staff, they had to be there at 8 o'clock or 8:30 or whatever time their shift started, and they had to be there until a certain time. So those particular roles, flexible working was flexible in a different way, but it might mean that perhaps they could work part-time, but the hours that they worked, the actual start times and finish times, couldn't be too flexible because of the nature of the role, in that the service desk was open it was open 24/7. So their role couldn't be flexible in terms of start and finish times, but it could be flexible in the days that they worked. And the technology nowadays is such that you could potentially work from home for certain aspects of that role. So I think it's about being flexible about how you're being flexible.
Yes. Things change all the time. I mean, it's trying to keep things to work in a fluid society as opposed to a fixed society, which on some level things are still 1950. So where things are very rigid and everybody's expected to fulfill their commitments and own a certain role in their participation of these commitments. But it's the 21st century, and things have not moved forward as much as we would like to see them, or certainly as much as I would like to see them. And I'm sure you as well, that you're dealing with these women.
Yes.
Such, it's just not moving forward enough, and I don't know if it ever really will, to the point where we're all happy.
And I think there was an element that you can never please all of the people all of the time. However,
Correct.
I think there's a lot of movement, and this is cultural and societal change that we're talking about, and we all know that change takes a long time, and as long as we're seeing progress and as long as there are enough people, banging on the drums and knocking on the door saying we want flexible working and helping organisations. And I think sometimes it's not necessarily that organisations don't want to do it, it's sometimes that they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to approach it. They don't want to be seen to be favouring people more than others just because they're a woman or just because they're a parent. And so sometimes when you don't know what to do, the easiest thing is to do nothing.
Well, would you suggest that a parent, be it a mother or a father, present a plan to whoever they need to get approval from? Would that help either the human resources department or their immediate supervisors or the executives of the company? Would that benefit the company in making a decision?
Yes, I definitely think so. And I think the one thing I always encourage the clients that I work with is, when you present that plan, to not be inflexible in how you present it, in that rather than saying, I can only work Mondays, Tuesdays and Wednesdays, but it's, saying what you would like as an ideal, but being prepared for compromise. And I think if you go in there saying, I will only work these days and I will only work this time and I've got to work from home on a Friday or a Thursday or whatever. But if you can go in there and be prepared to negotiate and be prepared to compromise or to present alternative solutions, then it's going to make it a lot easier for your supervisor or for the HR team to come to an agreement. I think very often if you go in there with a very fixed idea of what you want,
that's not a plan. That's not a plan.
Yeah.
It's sort of a statement, and it's usually it could come off as aggressive, and that's not the way to be too much. But I'm looking at it, having a plan with options, coming forward with something that people have an out. The people you're talking to try to make a plan with about flex work or shared work or however we want to label it, they need to hear a little more information in order to say, let's look at this, let's look at that, or to say, why don't you change that aspect of your plan to X, Y, and Z and see if we can make that work. Because
exactly.
Yeah, as you say, the flexibility is key. Instead of being inflexible on flex work, one must be more flexible on shared work or shared time or whatever.
And I think one of the things you can do to help yourself prepare for that is by looking at your plan from the employer's perspective. Mm-hmm. If I was your manager, where would I be having an issue with this? What would be the problems that I'm likely to foresee? And I think if you can try and foresee the issues that might come about for the business or for your manager or for your team members, then that goes a long way to demonstrating that you have considered this from all aspects and showing your employer that you're not trying to be unreasonable, you're trying to be willing and flexible and to look at it from a collaborative approach rather than a this is what I want type approach.
Yeah, from the macro view as opposed to the micro view, the micro view being me or whoever the individual is. It's a big picture situation.
Absolutely.
It's a big situation in the world, and it will only change incrementally if the parent goes in there without, a demand, but with a plan, which I think that might help over time.
And here in the UK, we have legislation in place now that a business is, if somebody submits a request for flexible work, and then the business has to consider it and to give reasonable, they can't just say no, they have to take that on board and consider it. I think one of the other things I've noticed very often with employers is that they may well be willing to consider flexible working, but if they don't say it in the job advertisement, then the candidates who want flexible working will automatically self-deselect and say, well, they've not mentioned flexible working, they've not mentioned working from home one day, so therefore I won't apply. And I think sometimes just by simply saying willing to consider flexible working will open up open the opportunity up to more candidates who want flexible working.
And I also think women, again, need to be more confident about asking for what they want. Even if it doesn't
Yes.
say that, they have to inquire and to find out the answer to their question. Will you consider flex work? And they might have it in the back of their mind, but not want to add more words and more cost to the ad, whatever. But,
Yes.
that kind
Oh,
of.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, often, it's like you hear the stories of how a woman will look at a job advertisement and there's 10 bullet points and she can only fulfill 8 of them and thinks, oh, well, I can't do everything. And
Mm-hmm.
whereas perhaps other people might look at it and say, well, I can do 2 of those. I'm going to go for the job. And it's that same sort of thing, isn't it? We they haven't specified flexible work and therefore I'm not going to apply for it. Yes, the employer could mention that in their advertising, but equally, it's down to us to ask for what we want. And if we don't ask for what we want and don't do it in a way that's not demanding, but is putting the idea out there, because it may well be the employer's open to that, but they just hadn't thought about it.
Right. They need to be reminded. And
Yeah,
it's
they
our
need to
job
be
to
reminded,
remind.
particularly if there's not been a precedent in that particular firm or organisation. They might just need to be reminded that flexible working can work.
There we go. Flexible working can work. One other thing I want to focus on, it's probably a 180-degree change, but I asked in your pre-interview questionnaire, what has been a lesson or advice that has stuck with you through the years? Would you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah. Oh gosh, the lesson. So this is something I learned from my dad. Actually, he always encouraged me to. Well, a bit sneaky, really. I had a manager that I was not enjoying working with, and he said, "Well, get them promoted, get them headhunted, tell a recruitment agency about them, and get them
Ah,
headhunted out." And then the other thing he said, but don't always share your knowledge. Always be helpful, be friendly, because if you make yourself so indispensable or so irreplaceable, it makes it very difficult for your boss to promote you,
mm-hmm.
and that you'll end up getting stuck in a role. So, one of the great things when I was head of IT for the London office, I was invited over to Chicago for 2 months to review the way the firm-wide IT team was working and look at the practices and the policies. And I know that if I hadn't been the kind of manager that shared my knowledge and shared my experience and made sure we had documentation and that I got my team involved so that I was constantly bringing them up and teaching them and so that they could develop their own knowledge. If I'd held on to that power and knowledge, if you like, I know my London boss wouldn't have wanted me and wouldn't have allowed me to go over to Chicago for 2 months. But because I was able to persuade him that my team knew everything that I knew and, that we had good policies, good practices and procedures in place, that allowed me to persuade him to let me go to Chicago for 2 months, which was, the best time ever from a work perspective, because that's eventually what led on to my next promotion to global head of IT service, was because I suppose effectively it was a 2-month interview.
Right, right. But this is something that I think my perception is that women shepherd relationships, whether at home or at work. And when you're shepherding something, you share information in order for the people that you are taking care of, quote unquote, to succeed. And if
Mm.
if your purpose in life, well, my purpose in life is to help others succeed in any way I can do that. That means I share information, and you do as well. And to do that, I mean, you have 2 businesses or 3 that provide other people with information that you give to them. So I think that that's really important, is that we give information out and not be so secretive about what we know and hide it under the table and all of that jazz. And it worked for you, and it was a great benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think very often, certainly in technology is my background, and there were some technical experts that I worked with, and if you'd ask them a question, they would answer your question, but I didn't know that particular piece of code, or I didn't know that particular technology that well. So I was asking the question that I thought was the right question, but whereas if I could sense that somebody was asking me a question, I thought that's not really what they want to know. And it's about
Mhm.
sharing that knowledge. Say, well, you've asked me this, and that's the answer to that. But I think what you maybe wanted to ask me was this. And so it's about sharing the knowledge so that, because sometimes you ask questions, you don't actually know what you don't know. And I think
Correct.
that's part
Totally.
of sharing the knowledge is sharing what you know and not holding it, because I know some people feel that knowledge is power, whereas I felt that sharing the knowledge was power.
I agree with you. Sharing the knowledge is power.
Mm.
Well, before we wrap up, I want to let people know that Sherry Bevan has given a gift to the listeners of this podcast. It's called 7 Ideas That Work to Confidently Balance Work and Life. Now, it's a long link, but just so that everybody knows, it will be in the show notes so that you can get your copy of that ebook. 7 Ideas That Work to Confidently Balance Work and Life. And Sherry, do you have any final words before we finish the show?
I think final words, just look after yourself first. If you look after yourself first, and then everything works much better for you. And I think it's such an important thing to do, but so easy because it's the easiest thing to drop. But it's, from my point of view, it's the most important thing you can do for yourself and for your family.
I absolutely, totally agree. Well, listeners, I want to ask you a couple of things. I want you to go to the iTunes where Sherry Bevan's episode is. I want you to give her a rave review and also give the Sanity IT Project podcast a 5-star review. And you can also go to my website at askjoannevictoria.com and download a free book called The True Self Handbook, a guide to transform your life. If you have any questions, you can also ask Joanne Victoria on my website. And that's all for today. Thanks very much for being here, and take care, Sherry.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Sanity Project podcast. Please go to AskJoanneVictoria.com and continue the conversation on her podcast page. And get a free copy of her book, The True Self Handbook, a guide to transform your life. That's AskJoanneVictoria.com. Take care, and thanks for being here.